Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings and salutations. And might I add a pretty hearty welcome as well to the Safe Room featuring Security SideQuest. I would say thank you for being here, but I would also say gracias and a couple other different languages to the Safe Room featuring Security SideQuest. My name is Tristan Watty. I'm joined by the marvelous, the mysterious, the marvelous Russ. How you doing today, Russ?
I'm doing really well. How are you doing?
I'm doing peachy keen, as they may say.
Feels like the start to a good week. I feel positive about this week. It's gonna be a good one.
Yeah, it's gonna be a good one. Even though over here in the East Coast it's kind of raining, that means it's just going to be epic because the sky is going to open, the rainbows are going to shine, and we're going to talk about some fun security stuff. And we'll also say hello as people join in. But if this is your first time, to reintroduce myself, and I'm Russ as well. My name is Tristan Watty. I am a security consultant with AWS ProServe, where we help to accelerate customers' journeys to a cloud in a secure fashion, manner, and form factor, I would say. But Russ, where are you coming from?
I'm coming from the customer incident response team. I help customers contain and mitigate their incidents. So. Yes. You seem to be building up the customers and helping them set up all their things, and I kind of help them when things go bad. So
yeah, see,
we're kind of two ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, we're back and forth. It's like a game of ping pong, right? We just hopefully we don't go back and forth too much times, but iterative process, right? That's what we say. So I would also say, where's everybody else dialing in from, tuning in from, listening from? We like to know. And we would also like to know a very important question that we have queued up for today. And that is, what's your favorite summer food? Russ, favorite summer food, go.
Yeah, I mean, it's just when I think of summer, I think of lemonade and watermelon. So that's my choice. It's
lemonade. That's a good classic choice.
Yeah.
You could go to a bunch of different menus and see that on it. And then you're like, yes, finally, I am here.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of having summers off as a child during school and stuff like that. So it's a classic. I had to go with the classic. I couldn't come up with a fun response because.
Well, we can dig deeper into your response. Let's dive deep for a second. So, did you set up a lemonade stand? That's the people want to know this.
Oh, you know what? I didn't really. I just didn't live on a street that had good traffic. I think it was just location, they say in business, and I just didn't have the location for it. So, I was more of the, go around and like sweep people's driveways and stuff for or shoveling snow, stuff like that.
Yeah. It's funny. I could also just picture a young Russ with just like a pitcher of lemonade following people like, would you like a cup?
Just running down the road like, wait, you forgot your lemonade.
Yeah. But for me, favorite summer food, I would have to go with something of the barbecue variety. I want to say mine goes towards hamburgers, hot dogs, but there's a hidden star that people often overlook until they smell it and see it. And that is grilled corn, right? When you have it on the barbecue and there's some sauces, depending on the look, that's, chef's kiss, I would say. Right? So,
yep, definitely.
Yeah. All weather barbecue is the best. Pork, chicken, and beef. Yes, definitely. Fruit salad is also a good choice. You have some watermelon, you have a bunch of different things. Right. But speaking of a bunch of different things, today, Russ, what are we talking about?
Well, you're right. Today is a bunch of different things. Today, we're going to talk about network security in the cloud. You don't have to have seen our previous episodes. Last week, we did do a DevSecOps episode. All your code base belong to us. That was actually a really good one. There was a lot of a lot to go over, but there was a lot of, I think, useful information in that one. So if you haven't already, go check it out. And, maybe while you're there, like and subscribe and do all those, fancy things.
Yeah, exactly. Like and subscribe. Make sure. Russ said it first, so that means you have to do it, right? It's part of your IR plan is like and subscribe.
Step 1.1.
Yeah, 1.1. Like and subscribe to the Safe Room Feature and Security SideQuest. And then the next thing we talk about is network security overall. Lots of fun things. And what we like to do within this fundamentals sections when we're talking about these different concepts is give you the buffet, right? The buffet approach of looking at what are some of the core concepts, what are some of the core definitions, and then we dive into it piece by piece. And in future episodes, we dive a little bit deeper with some sages. But within today, VPC 33, we're taking on an expedition in order to see, hey, how do I perform network security? What is network security, right? So what are some of the core concepts of VPC security? What are the foundations? Then what are some of the essential components of that? Subnets, routing tables, security groups, all those words. We'll try and explain a little bit, one piece at a time. And then eventually get into some security best practices for VPC design. What is inter-VPC communications and how do you monitor and troubleshoot? All these things are important, as well as saying hello to Victor, Victor, Victor. We are doing fine. We're talking about food, so we're getting hungry. That's kind of the thing, right? And then, Mel, are we in Seattle? No, we are not. I am on the East Coast in New York City. And Russ, where are you from?
I am also on the East Coast, but I'm by HQ too. So,
see, nice. We're all
which is
spread out.
That is fun.
Yeah. And then, what is network segmentation? That is a good question.
We're gonna get into that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Important part of security fundamentals is network segmentation. Right? You want to keep the public traffic, the private traffic kind of separated. And Mr. Chainsaw Man from Zimbabwe, thank you for joining in. Okay. So I think a way to dive into this concept, right, is starting out with maybe a poll. That might be a good way to open it up, right, to see what's going on. And since the theme is VPC 33 and taking an expedition, your expedition sets up camp. How do you shape your perimeter? Do you go the custom route, handcrafted isolation, defaults, pre-built speed, control tower, guardrails included, or do something like Terraform, code first defense? Feel free to put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat as we dive into it. Yep. Right. 1, 2, or 3, or 4. Which way do you go?
So the answer to this super contextual. So like they all have their time when they're the answer. Like for example, like default pre-built speed. There's even a time for that, when there's, I don't know, nothing set up whatsoever, at least getting the default in before you're able to add more or integrate, depending on your level of like maturity. I'm going to go with custom as like my ideal state. I think customizing it when done right, customizing for your environment is the way to go. But there's a lot of I'd say circumstances where, the Terraform could work if that's what you're using is Terraform, for container purposes. Control tower, I mean, they all have their place depending on what you're trying to do. But I would go with custom. I think in most cases, custom is the way to go.
Yeah. And that's a good thing. And you point out a couple of good pieces of the puzzle, right? It's depending on your maturity level, really, which way you're going, right? As you start out, you might start out with more the default or even control tower. And then eventually, as you mature, you get to some of the custom items of like, hey, how can I make this hyper specific to my environment without putting too much burden? And then you start to go into shifting left and Terraform and cloud formation, things of that nature. But if I had to pick one today, I would say control tower. Because what we've seen from our customer standpoint is, hey, maybe we're dipping our toes into the AWS cloud and we need something that we spin up with guardrails. And that's the important part, the guardrail component, right? Being able to put some different, like a log archiving account and different account structures in place with SCP policies, things of that nature. Very important. And I zoom in and say very important because it's very important. Guardrails, 100% guardrails. And we're going to stick at this guardrail as we delve in a little bit deeper into some of these foundational items, right? So where do we start? what are some of the core concepts? VPC. Well, virtual private cloud. We'll start off with the actual name because people often refer to it. So it encompasses a variety of different security mechanisms. Think of flow logs, NACL, VPC endpoints. All these words go into place when you talk about AWS network security, right? There's some of the core concepts, right? It's all these words because a lot of the times it's the definitions that get us, right? It's like, what is this? What is that? What is a NACL? What is a VPC? What's an SG, right? And you start to kind of spiral off. But if you take the fundamentals to start off with, what a virtual private cloud is hey, you own a little space, and then within that space, how do you secure it? And that's where these definitions start to come into play, right? So all those who are network security at heart, this is the episode for you. Right. So as we continue to dive in, why don't we think of something VPC flow logs? That comes next, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a good part. So when you think of VPC flow logs, right, it's just the network traffic, the metadata. Think of IP addresses, ports, different protocols. They help to identify the security threats and troubleshoot connectivity issues. Something that we want within our environments, right? So from your side of the house, Russ, when it comes to kind of VPC flow logs, how often do you look at those?
A lot, basically all the time. And that's one of our number one challenges as a team is being able to gain visibility into environments when we, don't have logs, when logging is not enabled. There is, still CloudTrail event history, but it's really only management level, logging as opposed to, more specific. And so once we get to that point, it is a big gap for us and obviously the customer who's dealing with the incident. But there's a lot that could be missed by not having those logs, and a lot of questions, specifically during an incident that you want answered that are in those logs that, if you don't have access to, that's going to be a serious problem, and it's going to really hinder your investigation.
Yeah. And that's the thing is when you're going through an incident, you kind of want everything available to you. That's like when you're diving in, you're like, okay, let's look at the logs. There are no logs. You're like, wait. Right? So you want to make sure that you have something like VPC flow logs to go into, right? And then we have a couple of questions. Victor, endpoint security really matter or a zero trust? So let me follow up with kind of similar positive impact as the network segmentation. So a couple of good points there, right? And this kind of boils down to your network architecture itself. So when you think of endpoints, especially VPC endpoints, think of gateway endpoints. You have S3, DynamoDB, and then interface endpoints with AWS Private Link, for example, right? So there's a bunch of different benefits to having those, but what you want to do is make sure that you have the correct policies applied. And this applies to zero trust and it applies to VPC endpoints, whatever flavor that you're using, right? You want to make sure that you have your overall target state security strategy in mind when using that, right? Because you can have both. You don't just have to have one, right? And that's kind of one of those things I always like to point out, where you can have VPC endpoints in the environment, but you can also have zero trust concepts by using like Amazon verified access or verified permissions, one of those items for your remote in strategy, right? So getting rid of the traditional client VPN and then taking more of a zero trust approach to it. So you can go deep into it, but it's all part of the network isolation techniques and your policies, so on and so forth, if that makes sense. So thank you for asking that question, Victor. Always appreciate it. And I think the other part to appreciate is the identity aspect. That also plays a huge role in just your overall posture, right? So granular, I am controls. I am controls, I am controls. Say it 3 times for the people on the other side of the internet, as I always like to say, because you want to ensure the separation of duty. So you want to separate your network traffic. You want to separate the duties of the people within your organization and not in your organization, right? So Yeah, never forget another thing that many workers on vacation, AWS, Microsoft, etc. Well, yeah, people all go on vacation, and you want to make sure, hey, when they are dialing in, hopefully from some tropical place, are they doing it in a secure manner? Right? That's one of the first things, right? You're on a beach somewhere, you're like, okay, let me connect to this random Wi-Fi network to access our environment. Yeah, it's very important. So I think that plays a lot into just kind of some of the core fundamentals of understanding, right, Russ? Is you have the VPC flow logs, you have NACLs, of course you have CloudTrail, but CloudTrail, you think of API calls, things of that nature. From networking side, you're thinking VPC endpoints, transit gateways, network isolation, so on and so forth. So when we dive into some of the essential components, Russ, what are we looking at really?
So when we're talking about the essential components, we're really mostly talking about things like what we already talked about, well, introduced, subnets, routing tables, security groups, well, NACLs, that's all part of what we're going to kind of go into a little bit. So let's just kind of start with subnets themselves. As we're going through, now we know what a VPC is. So, what are we going to use within that VPC? First of all, we have to start off with our subnets. How are we going to manage those subnets? What are the subnets going to be used for? How many subnets are we going to, use? So you have a lot of different things to keep in mind and into consideration when you're doing this, because you do want to be able to use, subnets, both for public and private, resources in your account. So like public subnets, you're going to have your internet facing, resources, instances, NAT gateways, load balancers, stuff like that. And then, so that's going to be out open to the internet. And then the things that you want to keep private, like backend services, internal processes or methodologies, databases, stuff that's important. You want to keep on a private VPC that does not route to the internet. And so that's things that you have to keep into consideration. And so that's like its own network segmentation. But you also want to, reserve space for growth. You want to also like enable, it's like overlap protection or prevention. You want to, be able to set those VPCs up using, or set those subnets up inside the VPC in as best a way as possible. Yeah. And then you also, once we get through subnets and how you're going to set that up, then we're going to go, just talking about routing, we're going to look at like transit gateways, which is your hub for routing. There's a lot of considerations that go into this, especially cost. I know that that's probably one of the number one considerations for customers is the cost. So there's a lot of different things that you can kind of do with, routing and networking in general to try to reduce cost. I'm not going to go into all of those because it's a lot of preference and also could be its own episode.
Yeah.
It could be. We can talk about that forever. But yeah, and then you also want to consider any sort of restrictions or considerations for your environment. So if we're talking about cross-region considerations, cross-account considerations, depending on what you're doing, I don't want to make any kind of like assumptions because they're just so customizable and used for anything. So I don't want to be like, well, if you're going to do this, because maybe only 10% of the population or the customer base is going to be using a VPC that way. So there's just so many different ways that it's not even really worth it to go into specifics as much until we get our great sages involved. But yeah, so then you want to look at your security group. So when we are talking about security group as opposed to like a access control list, like a network access control list, the network access control lists are going to be applied at the subnet level. The security group is going to be at the VPC level. And so this is going to be managing the entire VPC. So you put in, like, for example, put in explicit allow and deny policies into the security group, excuse me. So that way you can, do an allow list only for these ports at these IP addresses, to really fine tune that access control. And only really give access to very specific IP addresses, ports, so if you want someone to be able to SSH from, a specific IP address within your, company's IP ranges, that's where you would go ahead and do that. And you put on allow. And then that way you're only allowing the actual traffic that you want coming in, which is especially critical for things that aren't like supposed to be accessed by the entire internet. So if it's just your website, like you're not going to be denying HTTP traffic at all, really. So so it depending on what you're looking to do, security groups give you that level of control over who's accessing the VPC itself. I think we'll get into NACLs a little bit later, since they're subnet specific, and gives you a level of finer control over what is being accessed. But generally speaking, they can be used to complement each other, network access control lists and security groups. So there's a lot of different implementations that could be done there. So yeah, I think that there's and also routing tables. So you can have custom routing tables, but so the routing tables are actually going to control. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? The routing tables are really just controlling the network traffic within the VPC, correct?
Yeah. So the thing to look at when you're looking at overall, right? And I think this is worth taking that step back as well. See what we did there. So as you were saying, Russ, parts of it is what's the subnet, right? Segmented VPC IP address range, essentially, right? And the subnets are defined by the CIDR block, a range of IP addresses. And they exist within that specific availability zone, and you think of 10.01.0/24, something along those lines, right? Each subnet exists in a AZ, and then there's a VPC association with it, right? So now when you start to think about, okay, every VPC has one main routing table inside of it, and it's created by default when you create that VPC. And it's used by that subnet, right? So that's how you have that direct connection and things of that nature in order to route traffic out appropriately. So things that I mentioned in the chat as well. Hold on, we'll take that second. Get back to that. The Sniper has a question. What would be the best ways to mitigate risk if connecting to an EC2 instance with SSM, besides only allowing to assume roles and other IAM controls? So this goes back to our conversation about VPC endpoints, right? Deploy a SSM VPC endpoint to keep traffic within the AWS network itself. And you can also restrict using security groups, private subnets, things of that nature. And then within that, you can also have session logging and auditing and things of that. That same area, because what you want to ideally have is the isolation that we talked about, the different mechanisms. You mentioned IAM roles and controls, blocking that. But from a networking side, allowing, hey, who can actually do this from where? And having the appropriate access controls. You have IP-based restrictions. You can have instance tagging, for example, time-based access if we start to get into the JIT world. So a bunch of different mechanisms to do that. So thank you for asking that question, Sniper. So that all goes back into what we're talking about. subnets, routing tables, security groups, right? As Russ mentioned, routing table, it contains a set of rules that determine where network traffic is directed, essentially. That's the plain simple of it. And you can manipulate that routing table however you want. So if you have a target range, example, quad 0/0, all IP addresses go this way. All right, that's what it's going to do, right? Whatever you set that up to do is how the network traffic is going to flow. So when you are thinking about the security side of this, you have to be careful of opening everything up. And to Russ's point earlier, if you have something that needs to be internal, opening it up to the public world, it's not a good idea because that just opens your attack surface for people to trust. Hey, what are the other layers of defense you have in? One of the first layers is that networking layer, right? Can somebody reach? So think of it this way. Can somebody reach your house, right? Do they know what street you live on? Okay. Once they know what street you live on, can they get there? And if they're there, what other mechanisms do you have? And this is kind of where the zero trust conversation comes into play, where when you think of traditional network security is once somebody gets past the front gate, they're inside your house, right? They get in the gate, in the door, they're allowed access. And then zero trust comes in. All right, every room in that house, now you have to have authentication method, right? So in order to get from the front door to the fridge, now you have to authenticate at the kitchen, right? To say, is this person allowed? Who are you, right? Who are you to be eating the sandwiches in my fridge, right? So think of it that way. And I like to break it down to simple terms because then you start to think of, okay, how does networking come into play? How does routing tables, subnet planning for future growth? Because that's one of the main items that you should consider is, hey, you might have a couple devices, a couple individuals, users, but how do you scale? When you get to enterprise level, when you get from 5,000 to 10,000 to 50,000, how do you handle that? Especially across multiple accounts. So there's a lot of things that come into play. The other thing I would say that comes into play is understanding the key item and going around with this theme, right? Is we don't use swords. We use routing tables, knackles, and sarcasm as our main items of combating network security, right? So the way to handle this is to understand the different components. And sometimes to do that, you have to take a step back and understand what type of legends are there when it comes to network security. And that means we have to go on a side quest of the security variety. So as we delve into the side quest, we slowly set the stage and think about, what do we know? Well, say we have a customer, a network security architect. They're at a growing retail company, and they're tasked with establishing, let's say, a secure network foundation. Hint, hint. As they begin their cloud journey to AWS, the company needs to securely connect multiple store locations. They need to protect customer data. They need to ensure PCI compliance. Shout out to all the PCI compliance people out there. So when you think of this, this is a common occurrence. So what is usually a big challenge that customers face? And I pose this question to you, Russ, and also the audience is, what's your biggest AWS network security challenge?
I'd say what I'm seeing, I think it's probably related to access control lists. So like knackles and security groups. I do see that people, put in their different policies and then maybe, leave some out or accidentally put in a deny instead of allow, or unsure which, settings go for which level of a VPC and what networking layer. So I think I'm going to go with that, the access control lists.
Yes, and that is a good thing to understand, is what levels of access should everybody have? Because a lot of the problems also stem from that limited understanding of networking concepts as a whole. Figuring out what are subnets, what are routing tables, and as Hart said, as I personally think wrong, Amazon's collecting our precious sky clouds to keep data in it. The sky clouds. Thank you for that comment, because it kind of sets the stage a little bit more, because we're trying to understand what exactly are we doing when it comes to maintaining security while having cross VPC communications. There might be confusions between security groups and NACLs. So what we have to do is understand all these concepts, and the way to do that is to dive just a tad bit deeper. And the way we do this is we go on a SideQuest. And for this SideQuest board, if this is your first time, essentially this is a physical gamification of how we can understand our environment. So we have our authenticated user, as always. We have also our group of unauthenticated users who are trying to gather in. And we have our environment here with our VPC items. So along this path, it may be a short one, because usually it is short. When it comes to networking, it's like, hey, is it open, is it closed? Is it allow or denied? So we have to start thinking of mechanisms and ways in order to figure out, is this the right path for me? So, Russ, as we laid out all the different networking concepts, what is one of the things that we should look into? What should we do in order to help secure our AWS cloud?
I think that, as when referring to securing our network, I like to think of, especially because I think a lot of people are pretty much within the either fully on the cloud or doing some sort of hybrid on-prem and in the cloud. So I hate to go with access again, but like, how do you securely, access that data, especially if you're doing a combination of on-prem and in the cloud? How are you accessing that? How are you, securing, data in transit?
So that brings up a good thing of, we're talking about network, but we always go to identity portion, because as we mentioned, even from Sniper, it was mentioned like, hey, I know about the identity controls, but what else can we do? I think a good way is also to start off with the authentication side of the house, right? As we start to think out, it's a good piece of the puzzle. But oftentimes what we see occur is kind of a loop. Right back to, okay, authenticated users, what else do we have to consider? And as Stipe mentioned, the limited understanding of, hey, security groups, NACLs, are they a replacement for a firewall? I think not. It's a layered approach, right? Yeah. Because if we were to take that into consideration, do we have, something like WAF in place? Do we have something like Firewall Manager in order to manage our security groups? Things that often you have to consider. Because, again, it's a short path. It's allow or deny, right? So as we continue on our venture, what is the solution that we have to think about? Well, we have to think about, first, what are the controls that give me the most trouble? It's the understanding portion. And then what is the solution? Well, creating a well-architected design pattern. And how do we do that? Well, we figure it out. Done. And then we delve out. No, but we have to deploy a defense in depth, multiple security layers. And we have to constantly understand what is happening in our environment. And Security Hub is one of those pieces. If we're a retailer and we're trying to do PCI DSS compliance, hey, what are the different alerts that are getting triggered into our environment, into our VPC? And then that's where we have the NACLs and the security groups on top of our firewalls, on top of all the other security services. So good portions to figure out, because you can go guard duty, you can go config, network firewall, CloudWatch insights, VPC, reachability analyzer. All these pieces are the puzzle. But for now, we have to take the good old Zach Morris pause and time out. So if we were to pull ourselves out of the acoustic realm of the SideQuest and delve back into real life of how do we handle this? Well, what are some of the best practices? Oh, I think it's an interesting place to be. So let's dive in. When we think of best practices, secure VPC design. So to start out, you think of the overarching architectural approaches and design principles that create a highly secure environment, right? You balance security requirements versus operational needs. What are the outcomes that we're trying to strive towards? And I think the defense in depth is something that answers and agrees with Victor, where you have to figure out the entire thing or the infrastructure. And that thing is the definition that we're trying to get to. What is the thing we're trying to figure out? And then put networking boundaries around it. What, Russ, from your side, what do you feel are some of the best practices for secure VPC design?
Yeah, so above and beyond using access control lists, security groups, IAM, firewalls, we kind of already talked about all of that already. So I think that there's, a level of segmentation, separation, isolation, whatever you want to call it, that can be achieved. That's important. So example, prod versus dev environments, how are you doing that? You need to have dev, test, prod environments separated. There's also things you could do separating based off of say, for example, business units or access needs, stuff like that. But also when we're talking about, multi-account or, we start adding containers, infrastructure as a code, then we're kind of looking a little bit more into things like, say CloudFormation or Terraform, version control, you're automating deployments. There's a lot of things that you can do for, securing, not just the VPC itself, but just important information that needs to be secured. There's also, I hate to bring it up because I know that it's a favorite of yours, but there's also tagging strategies, that can be used to, manage your resources, what network goes for, or what VPC goes for what subnet, or vice versa, and then what it's being used for. I think that there's also a lot of, classifications you can use for your network segmentation. The words, man, they're just getting so jumbled up. Can you tell that I was on call today?
Yeah.
So within network segmentation, as far as managing those resources, there's things that you could do like data classification, which is kind of, I guess, a little bit more specific than private versus public subnets, but digging a little bit deeper, you can have different levels of classification for the information, like critical, or just high confidentiality or whatever it may be. And then, there's a lot more that could, a lot more that can be done, not just with tagging, but also, using different services like proxies, WAFs, like we're talking about, to kind of reroute and give you that extra layer of separation from the internet. And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot that could be done in terms of because basically when you're looking at it, right, we have, as far as the layers go, we have NACLs, security groups, and we have WAF rules. You can implement proxies. Hopefully, you're doing some sort of session management, so that way, if someone is you're basically monitoring and seeing who's doing what on the network to be able to kind of control that access. And then I think another thing that is a part of security that doesn't really get talked about enough would be recovery. So having backups that are fully isolated and able to, bring those up, for not just ransomware, but in case of, disaster or, any other type of business recovery.
And the one point I would also add into this, right? Again, first, let's get to the comments, because Hartstead asks, if this isn't a good question, but most security scenarios, is it a manual attack to find vulnerabilities, or is it more automated scripts looking for common holes? So, simple answer, it's a mix of both, right? So, automated and manual techniques when you look at it, right? So, you think of the automated attacks, credential stuffing, brute force, vulnerability scanners, web application scanners, things of that nature. And then you get to manual of like, hey, what role does it play when it comes to this? It's usually post-exploitation activity, right? Once the automated picked up something, now you might have more of a manual data exfiltration effort, some lateral movement within the environment, advanced persistent threats within your environment. They're highly targeted attacks depending. So it's a real mixture of both. That's what my initial thought would be. But Russ, what do you see from your side?
Yeah, it is definitely a mix of both. I think that there's a lot of, because when you say manual attack, I mean, it's not like most people aren't generating those scripts, custom for each attack anyway. So I'd say it's probably more automated scripts. If we're talking about scripts, I mean, a lot of tooling is used, right? That's automated, not necessarily AI, but like just running a vulnerability scan, or even just doing, like a quick, like ping test against, whatever's open on their, whatever ports are open. You also see a lot of tooling for credentials. So like, for example, there's tons of tools out there to check whether or not your AWS credentials or secrets, like GitHub has that credential checker to see if your repositories have any secrets from AWS or the credentials. So those things are being automated and basically doing the legwork for attackers. So, I mean, when you're talking about like manual, I don't think anyone fully does manual from start to finish, but yeah, I think that most of it is being done with scripts or tooling. But then, like you said, once you're actually in the environment, for like after the initial compromise, then you have to start taking the context of your environment into account, and that's when it starts to become a little bit plug and play based off of what you're trying to do and what you're being faced with. So, yeah, I'd say a little bit of both.
Yeah, it's a mix. And then if we take it all the way around, because it's a good question and it kind of fits in the topic as well, right? We like to go off the rails and then come back on and then go off again, right? Yeah. So when you think of a secure VPC design, what you're trying to do is these automated attacks and these manual attacks and everything in between. Multi-account VPC strategy. What is it, right? You're segregating network environments by or for business function, right? So you separate AWS accounts, you have strong isolation boundaries, you limit the scope of the potential breach, for example. IAC, to Mel's point, right? What do you use to provision? CloudFormation, Boto3, Terraform, or Console? So ideally, you want to go and shift left to using more IAC, right? CloudFormation, Terraform. It ensures consistency, you enable version control, and you also help with your compliance auditing capabilities within your environment. It's a big thing, right? Because when you have these mechanisms in place, now to Russ's point, now you can have pipelines, and those pipelines can take things from dev to UAT to prod. All those things you consider. But yes, and you're welcome and thank you No, thank you. Going back, I know Russ mentioned tagging strategies, but you want to make sure you have a tagging strategy. Are the resources labeled to track ownership? That is a big thing. When we do a tabletop exercise, it's like, okay, who's the account owner? All right, we have to look through this list and maybe potentially, and if this person's on the beach, then we don't have anybody. So making sure that you have a tracking ownership functionality using tagging, data classification, as you mentioned as well. Then if we want to go more towards the networking side, we want to make sure, hey, Bastion hosts, is there secure Bastion host configurations, right? Do you have hardened jump servers for minimum level access, right? Do you have enhanced logging or multi-factor authentication? All these things to have in place, as well as the ability to say thank you. Thank you for joining as always, Victor. And the last point in a secure VPC design is, hey, what is your disaster recovery? To your point, Russ, is how do you recover from this? If something were to happen with this network, do you have that failover mechanism? Do you have a different AZ or region mechanism? What is your redundancy, right? And this is something that's often that tightrope to walk when it comes to cost versus recovery, right? This is often the thing that we talk about. So you want to have an idea of all these items because, hey, if you were to take something as simple as how do I access a system, right? And we have a poll for this as well, because when you think of, hey, how am I going to access a critical system? What's your secure path in? This is something that should be thought of and should be a consideration, because if you go with step one, you have a Bastion. It's a classic stronghold approach. SSM, agent-led provision, VPN, tunnel through the void, or Amazon Workspaces, managed desktop front.
Yeah.
So which way do you go? Russ, choose your destiny. Which way are you connecting securely?
I'm probably going to do 2 or 3. Well, actually, I'll go 2 or 4. I think in this case, in my opinion, this feels like a, why recreate the wheel type of situation. If this is the sort of thing that I'm like, hey, if I could just put in a solution, this would be the time for me. So I'm gonna go with either SSM or Workspaces.
Yeah.
Not that there aren't VPNs that you can get a service for, but yeah.
And I think there's something to be said about the classic stronghold, the Bastion, the jump boxes, but I would go with SSM. SSM is very powerful when you have it set up and configured, when you're managing, let's say, enterprise level environments, right? You want a consistent mechanism that you can use, that you can control, that you can apply different policies to. Right? So I would go, the SSM route. And feel free, put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat, depending on which route you would go when you have to access a critical system. So another question comes from Mel. Have you noticed when doing a project, you get 50% cloud formation can do, but then there is a gap and you need to use a CLI command to progress. Then again, you can use cloud formation, and this makes it extremely hard to make automation. So this is an interesting thing. And I think this boils down to what is your overall design approach, right? So you're going to use cloud formation. What are you going to use cloud formation for? Are you going to use it to provision the VPC, the networks, the security groups? What are you going to do, right? Because certain times you might need to leverage a multi-step and a multifaceted approach, right? The same thing can happen with Terraform, and maybe if you're using AFT or something along those lines, you want to make sure that you understand, hey, let me break this down a little bit into maybe multiple cloud formation templates, or have a pipeline in place, and then that's how you have and you work through these different items, to your point. So it's definitely one of those things where if you try and stuff everything into one, sometimes you're going to run into more and more roadblocks that you can overcome, but it gets a lot more complicated. So Thank you for that question. Yeah, because see that all the time when you dive in and you're just like, all right, let me just put this CloudFormation template and wait, I have to go this way, right? And you spend your time spinning the wheels a little bit, especially when you think of, let's say, having multiple VPCs. And that's often another challenge, the inter-VPC communication methods, because when you think of the security considerations that come with that like, hey, I need to manage this VPC and this VPC against this AWS account in this region. And there's a bunch of different connectivity options. And it can become overwhelming, right? So this is where the services like, hey, Transit Gateway start to come into play, right? So if you have a global view of the interconnected networks, you have monitoring capabilities for troubleshooting. That's one of the main things that you want to have is visibility into your network protocols and making sure, like, hey, something simple as route propagation controls. It's like, all right, do you have your network set up? And this is going to get into the networking side of the house. So when you are advertising, do you have selective advertisement of the networking routes to ensure that traffic flows into its intended paths and it prevents that undesired, let's say, cross-network visibility? So this is important because if you take it back to the command line of trying to figure out networking, it's like, all right, you have the ACK and the SYN and all those things are going back and forth. But when you advertise routes, you don't want to always advertise all your routes, right? Because this can create a larger attack surface and pretty much allow propagation down into parts of the network you don't want it to propagate to. So having those controls and those blocks in place is a very important part, right? So we talked about the routing table and understanding. So you want to have selective advertising. So important part of the puzzle. And then your security group strategy. This is another piece. When you have inter-VPC communication, you want to make sure you have coordinated security group configurations across your VPCs. You can leverage something like Firewall Manager, or you could just have a strategy in place to understand. One, descriptions. That is an important point. I don't know if you ran into this, Russ, where you have a ton of security groups. And what does it do? It says security group 1, security group 2, security group 3. It's like, what is this for? Right? Having tagging and descriptions, very important within your environment. And can help accelerate a couple of different things, right? And you also want to make sure, depending on your industry, centralized versus distributed inspections. That's something I always like to mention because your architectural choices are important. Because if you have inter-VPC routing, right? So routing all your cross VPC traffic through a central security appliance, that's one approach. Or you have distributed security controls at the VPC boundary. So do you route everything through a centralized point, or do you have multiple items handling their own items? Right? Items handling items. I got to figure out another word for items. But you want to make sure that, like, hey, if you have one VPC and you want that one VPC to be isolated in such a manner that it handles all of its traffic, then it reports, opposed to everybody kind of centralizing. Important part. And this is where your target state security strategy comes into play. All important parts of the puzzle. And another important part of the puzzle, Russ, I think you know what that important part of the puzzle is having the aura of knowledge quests. You gotta irradiate the aura.
For some reason, it's coming from the neck, but that's okay.
Yeah, that's where your aura comes from the neck.
I think mine comes from the belly, you know?
Yeah.
You got the belly aura.
Yeah, the belly aura. See, that's where the security groups are. It's in the belly. Right? So you start off with that. You go on a knowledge quest. And what is a knowledge quest? Well, it's something you like to dive into and just figure out, hey, how do I exactly go on something? How do I build something? How do I understand what they were just talking about? Well, you go on a knowledge quest. And the way to do this is dive into some documentation, some workshops, things of that variety. And you may ask, how do I know which way to start? Well, we start, as always, with a blank canvas, and then we add some words to it. So when you think of VPCs, what's a VPC? Well, think of the documentation. You go there, you start off with, this is your exploring phase. This is your explorer level. This is your explorer badge, the L100 level. And where I am kind of biased to go to is the best practices for every service, including VPC, where you look at the definitions and you're like, do I understand what a security group is, what a network ACL is, what VPC flow logs are? Well, there's links to dive into each one of those there. And then you start to get a little bit more confident. You try to figure out, all right, now how do I connect multiple? I have a lot of VPCs. What does inter-network VPC traffic look like? How do I set up my security groups? Send the documentation for that. Right? And that's how you round off the level 1 pieces. It's very important. Because once you do that, you go from explorer to adventurer. And then within an adventurer, you figure out, hey, what tools can I use to help me out so I don't have to dive into understanding each routing table, each component all the time. This is one of the places. Use the network access analyzer. What is it? Hey, it says it right there in the documentation. It's a way to figure out what network items within your AWS environment are and how are they functioning. Do you have network segmentation or internet accessibility for the different pieces of your environment? Very important part. And if you don't think you can just go through the normal documentation, you need some more examples, some more practical real world experience, that's where you can go into the blogs. And 2 ones that may spark the creativeness in you is, hey, establishing a data perimeter. How do you allow access to company data only from expected networks? So there's a couple of different functions, a couple of different ways to do this. It's a great article to go through and understand, like, hey, what is data perimeter and how can I leverage this, right? Because it involves some networking. It involves some key concepts that you should understand, especially when my resources can only be accessed from expected networks. What expected networks are they? How do I do this? Things like that. And also another one, just delving into evaluating the impact and refining your controls. This is how you become an adventurer. You look at what you have and you use it in such a way that is effective, that is optimized, so that when you become an expeditioner, see what we did there with the title, we can start to go on a couple more ventures, a little bit of a deeper dive, and figuring out what are the approaches to layered security using VPCs. You know, what is DNS security? How do you delve into that? Network analysis. All these are pieces of the puzzle that build up your expeditioner prowess, let's say. And then eventually you snap back to reality and say, hey, I know this. I got this. I understand this. But how do I continue to level up? Well, you practice some more. You get hands-on keyboard. You start to review other pieces of documentation and connect because you build experience points that way. And every XP point eventually leads you to level up not just yourself, but your overall security posture of your network. But if something were to go wrong, I think there's a certain piece of information that we should have, right, Russ?
Yes, you should. And it's an incident response plan. Please, yes. If you don't have one, create one.
Yes, please create an incident response plan. Because this is how it also helps you to find out what you're missing within your network environment, right? Or absolutely. Quick cert kind of thing is, hey, how do you have an isolation security group? Is it in your incident response plan? Little things like that, right? Also, speaking of little things, come back, like, subscribe next week. Every Monday, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. PST. We like to have some fun. We like to dive in. We like to, hey, have fun. I like to say it a couple of times because you have to say it 3 times for it to stick, just like a certain word. So thank you for everybody who was able to join in today and provide feedback. Victor. Thank you. And see you next week. Take care. Ciao. And all that good stuff.